Welcome to Out of the Blank.
Welcome to another episode of Out of the Blank podcast here with Campbell. Campbell, my space age buddy, my UFO entrepreneur, the man who searches for things in the sky who people say don't exist, but then the government will say exists only in documentation or a national court hearing on live television. Welcome to the show.
Hey, Robbie, it's great to be back. I just want to specify, I do not personally search. I only search documents, not in the sky.
Well, tell me what's new in the world of the UFO. I've been out of that realm a little bit. I've been consumed in another universe, but I'm happy to dive back into it because hopefully you can free me from the topic I'm always mentioning, which is JFK, and get me interested in maybe some new, and plus I have some new thoughts on it as well too. So
Nice. Yeah, UFOs, JFK, cannabis, all these things kind of merge into the counterculture, don't they?
and you see them both when you're high.
Yeah. I don't know if JFK ever comes to me, but yeah, maybe one day. That would be novel. For the UFO subject, yeah, stuff's always happening, right? On like UFO Twitter, that's sort of the common ground where everybody comes together, like the top levels, people who are talking in the news, and then people from Reddit are sort of like filtering up into the UFO Twitter space. And most of it's just like a bunch of drama. There's not like a lot of information going on right now other than just like interpersonal conflict. And that I think is partially a result of there not being a lot of good information out there for people to focus on. And that's something you see in a lot of groups. They start to fragment and separate and dissolve in some respects when the predictions that led to their formation don't come to pass in a time frame that was expected, and then frustration builds and some people radicalize and get more invested, some people drift away, and I think that's sort of what we're seeing. So the social stuff is really what's happening right now, and I could get into a couple of those things if you're interested.
Sure, but before we dive into that, I think when I was putting the government tech way below, but then after speaking with someone who York, who basically studies and kind of observes Area 51, listens into radio transmissions and stuff, we got to a point in the conversation where I mentioned coming across posts in academia, people that were able to project things with no screen, just project things on air. And I mentioned this to him about, could this be possible? This is what Tic Tacs are. And we land in the area now where I sent you a message on Twitter of FBI on their government website. They had UFO unidentified phenomena, basically documents on there. And they were like, can we, they had classifications and documents. Is this real? Is this fake? Is this real? Fake? How many sightings did you see? All this. And this has been dating back since the 60s, since the 50s, a little bit too. So, I mean, they knew about this. So to say that at one point there was something they couldn't explain and they called this UFOs or what, maybe a craft or something. Do I think that we're just commonly being visited by aliens? I don't. I think maybe we got some type of, maybe a craft. I don't know. I don't have evidence to back that up, but I said maybe this is where the conversation started, and have we been able to modulate or fix that equipment or make adaptations of it to our own accord? I think that's possible, but I also think that you have to analyze the area of when a lot of this was happening, which was deciphering if it's a UFO or if it's Cold War technology. And if we get into the area of Cold War technology, we also get into the area of what the government does to do propaganda. So such instances where I've had guests on explain, the military has been involved in Hollywood for a very long time. You could look back to J. Edgar Hoover looking for communists, using the FBI agency to look for communists in Hollywood, having profiles of Frank Sinatra and all these other types of characters, and figuring out FBI informant was Walt Disney. So you get into this area, okay, if we talk about propaganda, imagine the best propaganda machine would be able to project equipment on air, basically, without a projection screen from a craft to show something that is high advanced tech to not only scare your enemies, but also freak out areas of population. And then we get into areas like MK Ultra, Operation Mockingbird, and Operation Bluebird, whatever you want to say, where they land in this area of civilian populations being affected by something. And that could be such instances of propaganda or such instances that would cause over dramatic change and regulation when it comes into government tech. And what I mean by that is a bunch of people being scared that a UFO craft is flying in the air and wanting the government to do something about it, where the government decides to lay a bunch of funding down to make sure that they can study whatever this thing is. And now you have more instances now where they're not only just getting funding, but also being able to research into technology that necessarily would be seen as a way to combat these things when they were the ones that created it in the first place. That's what I've been thinking about because it had me down these routes and things. And I think there's a lot of weight you could put in that. I'm not completely debunking or throwing out the alien thing, that's for sure. But I think that's probably a more reasonable conclusion when we talk about just government fuckery.
Yeah, well, and that's an important way to look at it is probability. The way I approach it is from an academic perspective, and I'm, a skeptic. I don't believe that extraterrestrials or the other hypotheses people have put out there, interdimensional beings, hollow Earth people, space time travelers, all of this stuff. I'm not buying it, but it's not that I'm intrinsically opposed to it. It's that there's not sufficient evidence compared to things that are more likely, like you're describing. That said, I my perspective is to look exclusively at the science and the government archive documents, exactly like you're describing. And from a purely descriptive perspective, without getting into hypothesizing about what they're doing today, there are some really neat things in the old documents like you're describing. And for example, there are CIA memos from 1952 that are internal memos that were declassified in, I believe it was 1978 through Freedom of Information Act request. And they're talking about how in July 1952,
Are you
there
reading
were the,
something?
am I reading something? No.
You're like squinting like you're reading off a screen. I also wanted to, I should have clarified this before we started. I wanted to give you, you have screen share options. So at any point, you just want to also not only just promote your site, but also show anything on your site that you think I would be interested in. Feel free to, because you always have good stuff on there. I go on there. You haven't changed it in a while, which I'm upset about. I told you to add teams um, of
Yes.
researchers, but okay. Apparently you joined another crew and left everybody.
That was just me on my site. But yeah, you're right. I have not updated it in a while, and I got it to a pretty good place where I wanted it to be. But now I do have a backlog of like 100, 200 pages of notes of new information that I want to add at some point. I just haven't felt inspired yet.
I'll
I
inspire
will.
you.
Yeah, well, okay. Okay, before you thought that I was squinting, I was saying the CIA's documents. And so the CIA's documents in 1952, the internal memos, they're talking about the exact things you're describing. They're saying, what are these things? They list the characteristics that people like today typically describe, like a luminous object, all these various accelerations and all of that type of stuff. So they're describing these like luminous unidentified objects in the same way as later they're defined as UFOs by prominent ufologist J. Allen Hynek. So they're talking about how can we control these things? Can we produce them? We believe that they're probably natural phenomena, a kind of ball lightning. There are other things that they think might be happening, like just more generic atmospheric effects, like mirages and stuff like that. Like light can be projected from over the horizon based on certain atmospheric conditions and stuff. But the main thing that they identify is this idea that it's like probably a kind of ball lightning that we don't fully understand yet. And then they're talking about, can we produce these things? Can we figure out how to control them? Will the Soviets figure out how to control them? And if they do learn how to control them, how can we react to them trying to use these phenomena either through control or as a natural consequence of them appearing as a distraction for a real attack? Because what happened in July 1952 was that there were so many sightings that the military's communication channels at the time got clogged. They could not communicate internally because there were so many civilians reporting the UFO. So they realized, wow, if this actually happened in the moment of crisis, we wouldn't be able to talk in a way that would damage national security. So we actually have to start dealing with these things. So from what you're saying, when we look at the actual like archive documents that are formal and declassified, you see that these guys on the inside have been describing a lot of the similar things to you. And in terms of the tech angle, it's a very interesting angle because it's not something that I am personally super interested in, like the history of military technology and stuff, but it certainly plays a big role in this conversation. But from what I've seen in the declassified documents, it indicates to me that it might be the reverse in some ways of what you're describing, because of the other very significant document we have is the UK's secret report about UFOs completed in 2000, UAP in the UK air defense region, that they used to brief top leadership as to the Ministry of Defense's understanding of what UFOs are. And they say the same thing the CIA memo said in the early 50s, that they think that there's some kind of ball lightning. They think that they're like real phenomena that are not fully understood, that are in the skies. And then the document says we're going to keep this secret because we're going to try to weaponize them, and we're going to try to figure out all of the different technology applications before we go public with this info, because we think the Russians are on top of this and they might actually be ahead of us on this subject. So it's a real danger that we need to get on top of. So it's interesting. And what do you think of this? Like, it's like it's almost like all conflated, right? Because it's like, oh, UFO tech, we're reverse engineering from UFOs, but like if they're actually creating technology from like ball lightning, if as the internal documents are claiming, then it's not like they are like it's almost true, like there are the objects in the sky that they are trying to like figure out and derive tech from, but then it's like they're saying in their own internal documents that they think that they're like a type of lightning essentially.
I think whenever you see a document that says the government's trying to find a way to be able to figure out what something is, and then it immediately goes to weaponizing it, I think it's a safe bet to say it's probably not something that they created, because most of the documents with types. But you also have to understand the FBI documents and the CIA documents both have documents on UFOs, but they do not match at all. They don't, speculation about what it is doesn't match, fear of what it is doesn't match, understanding what that is doesn't match. And that's because you have to look at an examination when it comes to other agencies acting without the other agency knowing. They don't need to, CIA and FBI does not need to respond to each other, does not need to talk about and let each other know what they're doing. And also, rogue actors in the CIA and rogue actors in the FBI are working on their own essential projects that they deemed more classified. For instance, if one agent's working on one thing, it could be a mission from another supervisor where another supervisor is giving a whole other agent a different information thing. So you have this aspect of now all your governments are not in line. Your FBI, your CIA, your NSA, they all have documents on this, but none of them match. None of them even are speculating around the same thing. There are different goals, it seems like, coming out of these documents as well, too. And I would, just from the conversations I've had, especially dealing with the CIA, I think you can charge a large chunk of that also when we talk about a pool for funding. Look at how the CIA has many projects where they've experimented on civilian populations, not only on an aspect of drugging people with LSD, but also just mind warfare, brainwashing, mind control experiments with MK Ultra, COINTELPRO, all these types of acts that are documented and that we know about in our history books. So I think if you're talking about the FBI coming across something, is it propaganda? Is it new technology from another world? Or is it the CIA that's been somehow slipping or doing something to distort a whole population to think that they saw something in the air? I think it's much easier to get tech to do that because drugging over 100 people is difficult. But it's also, when we talk about trying to classify what these things are, and when we talk about a lot of the issues now being social media issues, and not any new information really being brought out, it's because there's peaks and then there's lows, and we're in a state of low right now. There's not any new information because the peak was the government talking about it and openly addressing things that they had been denying for so long. Why they were denying it, I have no clue. I put a lot of weight behind alien people when they talk about it's an idea of things that they can't explain, things from another world, only because the government was hiding that. You don't hide something unless it is government tech or if it is from another world. So that's our peak. And now our low is, you have to leave up to researchers to try and get new information to release, which will bring up another peak. But trying to manifest a UFO for you to do your research is damn near impossible. So now you have to scroll online and look for videos and verify if it's real or fake. And it seems like every interaction that happens to be documented happens to have Mick West's name fucking attached to it. And every single person just wants to tweet at Mick West. So you get lost. And I think the conversation is sketchy trying to figure out the information behind UFOs. I think there's enough weight behind it to say that there might be something from another world, but I don't think it's the interactions that we come across every single day. I think future people is interesting, but I also think that we are discovering black holes and we're discovering white holes now. We're discovering different types of things in space that we have never thought of even existed before, relatively new discoveries. And the James Webb Telescope, I think, is going to help out in some aspects of that as well, too. I think it could be a possibility, but I just don't think we have enough information to classify future people at the top of the list. I think you have to look at propaganda. I think you have to look at technology that we've adapted to fit our own. And we also have to look at a distortion of the public. I mean, if you're basing all your conclusions on the government, but also saying that the government isn't trustworthy, then when you're looking at the government documents, you have to understand that not only are you kind of being a hypocrite, but at the same time, you have to look at the government's going to do anything for funding. And you could point a lot of fingers to say that's why they did this and that's why they did that.
Yeah, absolutely. And that's a good distinction that you're making. And that's a big part in UFO Twitter is the variety of different communities that make up the whole subject itself. And it took me a while to figure out how there is the core group of people who believe that UFOs represent some kind of intelligent actor, like whether it be a non-human intelligence or future humans or whatever. It's hard to even use words to describe the because it was like, extraterrestrials, the ET hypothesis. Then it became the non-human intelligence hypothesis, and then it was like, wait, no, it could be future humans, so non-human intelligence isn't right either. So then it's just like intelligent something intelligent is operating these things, I guess. So there's that community. And then there's another community that I initially identified as skeptics, but I've come to understand that there's a meaningful distinction. There's a large community of people who are within UFO Twitter who argue against the believers and also experiencers, who are people who have experienced something where they personally describe and felt was a UFO experience. And some of those could be legitimate observations of things. Other things could be like sleep paralysis and stuff like that. But then there are this people that I originally identified as skeptics who actually are people who are actively pushing a government tech angle from sort of a conspiracy theory perspective. And so the debunking of the believers thinking that these are like intelligent craft or whatever beings, the debunking is actually originating from a desire to push their own narrative, which is it's all part of a government tech project, which might be true, but right now we just don't have sufficient evidence to firmly point to something saying like that is what's happening, even if it's, as you're saying, more plausible. And there is technology that exists that would produce the effects that you're talking about since the earlier than that. In the 90s, they're starting with, it was earlier than that actually. But anyway, there's technology that astronomers use. It's called a guide star. And exactly as you're describing, I think they cross lasers in the ionosphere, and they create a patch of luminous plasma, and then they point their telescope at it and they use it to calibrate their telescopes because there are atmospheric oscillations, so that they get a little wavy effect in their viewing, their lens. So then they look at this thing that they know the properties of, and they can calibrate their telescope. Those things David Hambling's a science writer who in 2002 wrote a pretty cool article. It was published in the 40 Times that he well cited, where he talks about how I think it was the Air Force, was trying to put one of these things on the side of an airplane, almost like an AC-130 gunship with the turret, but it was like what you're describing, like a projection device capable of creating like essentially some kind of like luminous phenomena, similar, very similar to what people describe. So you can put those things together and come out to like, oh, modern sightings are this effect. But it's just that it putting, I think it's a bridge too far right now. And then you've got people like Mick West, who is like, a full-on debunker, and that's very valuable. Like you're saying, he does debunk all of these videos, and by debunking, I mean he brings in sufficient plausible explanations that are mundane, that even if not proving that the videos are not of something extraordinary, he introduces sufficient information to show that the videos are not necessarily exceptional. And by that standard, you then have to look towards probability. And like you're describing, the human origin through tech, or even natural through, like they say in the documents, ball lightning or whatever, that becomes more probable than like an extraterrestrial hypothesis.
As much as I give, like, I give a lot of weight to people saying it's UFOs. I think you can put a lot behind it. The reason why I say that is there's a lot of biblical references and a lot of old type of legend or myth or folklore from a time period that is not even close to ours that do resemble these types of figures. That's why the Anunnaki is a thing. The crazy side that you said you really haven't addressed, that type of stuff. It does get a little bit insane, but I also think that's the storytelling effect. I think a lot of people have taken a bits and pieces of something and morphed it into their own or what fits their best description. I mean, the grays are a common example. I think, there's descriptions of grays that range from super tall, super small, dickless, dick, whatever you want to say, where it's just different variations of maybe something that was a derivative of something. So to say that maybe people back in the day were seeing something and this is how they could account it into words, you can also take that in the opposite way. Is their intellect the same intellect that we have today? The words that we have or things that we can make distinctions on today, they probably didn't have for distinctions back then. So what maybe they were seeing, what's Neil deGrasse Tyson's example? People looking up at the stars and seeing like a fish coming out of a vase. Well, they were also high on drugs when they were seeing those types of things. So, those are our constellations and we line it up best, much like I think it's a epoxy, not epoxy. It's, oh God, what is it when you see a face in a cloud? It's
Oh,
a Goya,
yeah,
a Goya,
para it's
Paragoya.
like pareidolia, I think.
Yeah, pareidolia. So I mean that's a more, I guess, skeptic answer to that. But like I said, I put weight in it because of the biblical references, but also I look at the factor when we talk about, uh, I want to say, I think people underestimate our government a lot. And the reason why I say that is because you get leaks of government stuff in science, and talking to someone who studies migraines, and also like epilepsy that can be linked to people seeing different distortions. Like migraines can be caused by lights flashing on a screen. Well, at the same time, this conversation that I had leaked into an area where she talked about a researcher that was studying a way to be able to use these types of glasses that help limit certain colors so people can reduce the amount of epilepsy they might receive from something that flashes a bunch of pictures. Because what they start to realize is that with migraines and epilepsy or some type of seizure that somebody could have, there's certain light refractions that are getting crossed in their brain that are causing them to act this way. So if they're already working on glasses, we know they have glasses to help someone see color. I am not tossing out that the government has tech to be able to mess with light refractions in the sky to be able to make you fucking see something. I think our technology, our knowledge on that, the general public doesn't know about these things because they don't research specifically into this. And that's why I think it's good to have the conversation like we're having, not dismissing anything, but just talking about reasonable experiences or perspectives based on the information that you've consumed. I have information not from documents, but from people I've talked to that study different areas that you can find relations to. You have perspective based on documents that you've looked over and science that you've looked over from experts who study that field specifically. I think those go hand in hand. And that's why I like the UFO topic so much. I think instead of, maybe where it's diluted to now, where it's just arguing on social media about what it is. I think the idea that the conversation is still being had is still a good aspect to go towards, because like I said, there's still reference in government documents long before any of this technology that we are aware of them having has been spoken about or written down about. So people were seeing something. Now, if we look at witness accounts, the witnesses that talked about being chased by a UFO, I think David Halpern said that on my show. Um, I mean, you got to look at that as like, I mean, are these people crazy? Maybe. But then you start looking at a bunch of witnesses seeing something all in one specific moment. So is it that key, I guess, what is it, group memory, group type thinking that they start to have? But then you get to an aspect of where agents are now experiencing this, and where UFO community people validate expert pilots that are witnessing things as well, too. I mean, people that would have never addressed that they were an experiencer have told me off air that they were an experiencer, but they didn't want to mention their story. Where I start going, is this government messing with them? Or is this other some type of thing that we don't understand? Maybe something that we're perceiving like a mirage? I don't know. But the fact that there are people that want to hide the information that they are an experiencer and fear that they'd be lumped into a crowd is something that we have to get rid of. Because how do you expect to understand something if you're never fucking talking about the thing? You know, like it's weird. Like with like conspiracy talk, people won't mention conspiracy stuff. Oh, it's conspiracy. I don't want to get labeled a conspiracy. Well, shit, if something doesn't add up in your head, let's fucking talk about that, because we need to figure out what that is. You know what I mean? Like that's the whole reason why these things go on forever. Then you find out fucking Epstein's real and you're like, shit, we should have talked about that sooner, you know?
Yeah, well, that's a good example of something that was, described as a conspiracy for a long time, and then it was proven to be true, or at least a very high probability based on the evidence we have. So there's a bit of a balance between knowing that conspiracies are happening in general, like it's inevitable, and yet while they're occurring, you can't point to individual conspiracies until the evidence is available and say, oh, this is what's happening. So that's something that's used effectively by people in power, and that is also cited in multiple government documents from various angles. The CIA talks in depth about how the UFO subject is a dangerous subject, not because they're afraid of UFOs being aliens that are going to invade. They are very clear in thinking that it's some kind of natural phenomenon. They're worried about the Soviets using the subject to manipulate, influence the domestic American population in a way that would weaken national security. And the Soviets actually did do that, and they leaned in hard into pushing people to be more interested in UFO stuff. And one example of how this was useful for the Soviets is the Freedom of Information Act request process itself, because if you look at the early CIA documents, they're saying like, "Oh, we think these are natural phenomena. Da 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 da. We're going to study them." Who are the people who are very interested in getting all of these very deep-seated documents about advanced technology inside the government? It's UFO communities who are coming together, working together to systematically Freedom of Information Acts, access request each like special access program because they're searching for stuff about UFOs. So, in that way, foreign adversaries can actually create a domestic population of highly motivated people to try to get access to every internal government secret of value through their intent is to find stuff about aliens, but they end up producing this massive treasure trove of data about all these related, all these projects that are maybe related to UFOs in the sense of the internal documents describing them as this like phenomenon that they're trying to weaponize. But then the effect is that the Soviets are getting access to all these documents that they wouldn't otherwise have had access to. And that's, Russians now, obviously, but I'm referring to the prior government there.
Russian troll farms. It's a real thing. Top 10 sites on Facebook with over, I think the top one has over 3 million likes on it. And it's something like My Baby Daddy Ain't Shit is what the title of the page is called. And it just posts like worthless dad memes for single parents or single mothers that would like it because their baby daddy maybe doesn't pay child support. That's a Russian troll farm. It's a page that was created to stir up animosity amongst the domestic population. We know these things exist because someone that worked for The Intercept had investigated one of these buildings, sent pictures over of what that building was. It was an office building. I mean, probably really simple for a Russian, person who's distorting the public that works at one of these troll farms. Be like, I want to log in at 10:30 and maybe I'll get this done by next week. And then 20 minutes later, like, well, that was easier than I thought. It's because we're so ramped up on fucking social media. But that's when you look at a lot of the government documents and what I've scrolled through, I think over, I'm not going to lie to you, I think 126,000 something documents now. Specifically, most of those would probably be JFK, but I did loom across other documents that I thought was interesting. A file on Frank Sinatra, a couple files on COINTELPRO, a couple files on J. Edgar Hoover, a couple files on a bunch of different other things, Walt Disney being one of them, over 300 and something pages in part two of Walt Disney that I looked over. It's You really see what the overall goal is, and the overall goal is how can we stop other countries from messing with our fucking population. And that's when you start looking at things that they're thinking about that first, and then they're looking at what they're writing down second, being as what can we validate or what can we release to the public. So when you file an information request and one gets rejected to you, they also have to look, is this person actually an American citizen wanting to know, or is this just someone that is, I wouldn't say on the trail of delusion, but someone that is not part of this country that is trying to get private information. And that's why a lot of this stuff can't be released. It's necessarily not a conspiracy. There's probably a rational reason behind it, which makes sense when it's explained. But the idea of explaining it to you would be, I guess, a hassle in their eyes. So then we look at the information that does get released to us, people that do file FOIA requests and do get serious documents, either on JFK or UFO stuff. The Black Vault, for instance, getting some very private, confidential requests finally getting confirmed and documents being sent over to him, or denial requests that he can publish on his website as well too. Very good evidence to support that they're hiding something. Very good evidence to say that they've known about this for a very long time. But then it factors into another issue. If we can see it, they can see it. So you got to look at who else is going to come across this alien information. I mean, I think it was the UK, or it was, oh, maybe Australia, that released over 120,000 documents on UFO stuff. Back when we got our UFO release, that was only like 7 pages or 8 pages. They released a lot of documents, and every person I had at the time when this happened that I was speaking to on UFOs said, why did America not release any? Because maybe stuff of what we have is confidential, or maybe stuff is confidential because it's the government fucking with us. I mean, there's rational weight behind both of these. And I think it's the idea of, it's very, very simple. And the plan ends up going effective when the initial goal of two parties is one and the same, but then they end up getting divided. And then they spend the next 20 years or 30 years divided amongst each other, fighting across back and forth, where there's no weight being drawn on either side. And that is the best plan. And when you look at the government, that is the plan in general. They're doing shit that they don't want you to know. I mean, there's shit about the media. Did you know when they made Independence Day, the media had an issue with this original script to Independence Day, where they just blew up the White House in that major scene that everyone knows about. They also had an issue with the person who saved the whole race of humanity happened to be a civilian. That was another issue that they had. They wanted to be a military person. And at the same time, if they blew up the White House, the only way they were able to keep that scene in there was if they blew up the Eiffel Tower, if they blew up a bunch of other things that weren't just one country being attacked, because they didn't want to look weak to a superior force or some type of intergalactic being. They wanted to come off as strong. Where you realize that's a small thing, right? That's a big example to an iconic film. And being able to direct the flow of that script, or pulling out all your equipment if the director doesn't go by that, you start realizing there's other things out there. And I think you have to take that same examination when you start talking about the UFO subject.
Yeah, and you're bringing up a good point in that there are these really interesting historic documents with descriptions of the internal government positions on these things. And something that I've come across in my experience getting involved in researching this relatively recently, just started last May, was that frequently, like, the genuine skeptics, like Mick West and Jason Colavito and stuff like that, or maybe even the debunkers, they, because I look at the original documents and I describe the original contents of the documents, these debunkers have historically perceived that I am in like a conspiracy theorist, essentially. even if I'm doing a historical review of the documents in order to encourage people to cite their information if they're making claims in the community. So there's like kind of like a pile, like there's an interesting balance there where if you're even interested in the history, it would be like the history of conspiracy or the history of alien beliefs, like from a anthropological perspective. Yeah, like I've had in many instances in my own personal life over the last year where I have decided not to talk to people about this work because that I'm doing, because when I have brought it up, there have been instances where I like describe like, oh, I'm looking at the UFO stuff. I'm trying to help people look at like peer reviewed data. I'm trying to encourage people to get out of their false beliefs about it. Like I'm taking it from a skeptic, perspective. And then the next time I see them, they're like, oh, what's the alien stuff like? And it's like I never said aliens. I don't think that anything are aliens. I'm talking about the history of the beliefs and trying to actively provide information for people to cite properly. But with it just UFO subject, it's somebody who's like off the rails a little bit. They think that it's aliens and stuff. So it's a self perpetuating issue where, like you're talking about, you can't in a credible way even research the subject from an academic perspective without being labeled a little bit deviant or off the rails. And I think that produces serious issues in the academic pursuit of actually understanding the history of government from a standpoint of what is actually contained in these documents. I'd like to ask you, how did you first get curious at all about UFOs? Like, what was the trigger for that, if you can remember?
Ooh, well, that might be a little bit out there when it comes to how long ago. I don't know. I think a little bit before you were on my show, I had talked to a couple experiencers before, but it was mostly I had a couple people on talking about other things. First person, I think was guy. I think it's I don't want to pronounce his name wrong. I think it's Andrew. Um, might be Andy. I don't know. Andrew, I'm pretty sure. He talked about living in Alaska for a brief amount of time and talking about seeing this type of, triangle type thing. Three dots in the sky that look two-dimensional, fly over these and it was just a normal thing to him, like just fly over this like mountain ridge part where that you see these northern lights type thing. Then later on, I had a buddy of mine, Benjamin Bowman, who was on, who talked about the same exact thing, described it the exact same way. And these people did not know each other. I mean, they live on separate sides, basically, of the United States. Never have come in contact with each other in completely different profiles. But they were just people that, between like 300, maybe probably about a year gap in between, about 300 episodes. And then another person who was like, here's my alien shit, because we were talking about something else and he mentioned it and I had to ask about it. And he mentioned working on an oil rig, and it was just common for, there's a UFO right there, just common like that. Didn't want to talk about it a whole lot. Then it wanted me to reach out to experiencers and learn more about the subject. Or eventually I had you on, I had Api Loeb on, I had Mick West on, I had a bunch of people just start talking about this type of stuff. It's an interest of mine because I think when you start talking about people who necessarily don't, I don't like the demonization. Like the reason why I think debunkers are so interesting to people, like people like listening to people debunk things, is so whenever they get into a conversation about it and someone goes, well, how do you explain this? How do you explain this? They can fucking debunk it. They can do that, but it doesn't stop there. It lands into criticism of the person. Well, you're probably an alcoholic or you're this, and it goes in the worst possible direction where I go, if you really look at like a government standpoint, this is the best thing in the world. You have the most confidential secret shit that you're working on, something that you can't explain. And now you have the government not even worried about you keeping documents from them, but more on an aspect of what it is and how we can determine it and how they know that they're right because their job's more important than the other job. They're just sitting back laughing their ass off. The same thing I get into the JFK community. JFK community is worse than the UFO community. They fight over every single detail, every single aspect, every single witness testimony, every single this, and they're all fucking different. Where I go, we haven't made progress in almost 60 years on this fucking thing. And I'm like, look, there's documents that they said they were going to have released in 2021 that aren't released. Okay, so how do you get those out? Oh, confidential national security. No, you made a agreement in 1970 something that you would release them and you haven't released them. So that's an issue. You're not being true to your word. And then you realize the government's keeping stuff from you. And the best way they can do that is make sure the population fights amongst themselves. A house divided cannot stand. So you get into this aspect of when we talk about aliens, when we talk about technology, it's all the same shit. The reason why you can say JFK, people have written books about JFK and UFOs and all this type of shit. It's not that they're linked. It's just all the same government tactics are displaced everywhere. The reason why if you come across any JFK researchers, they research not only JFK, they research his brother's death, RFK, then they research the MLK assassination, then they research Malcolm X. And then you start finding government tactics linked in between all of them. That's why I'm smelling notes of, JFK or RFK, and I'm looking into MLK because they use the same tactics of distortion. It's just a different time period where they might have adapted new techniques, but they just evolved a lot of them. And it's to me, it's just interesting because I think it's like the best strategic standpoint thing ever. And you have to talk about that. Like, why is Russia so interested in these types of things as well? Russia is interested in UFOs a little bit, but they also have a longer experience when it comes to nerve agents. We gave up nerve agents a while ago. Russia agreed to give up nerve agents and biological war as well, too. When we say they signed a biological weapons ban, you go, well, they noticed how destructive it was. That's what history knows it as. They realized how destructive it was. No, it wasn't. It's good on paper when it's read and recorded that way. The real reason is because how much money it costs to keep all that stuff, to manufacture all of it. It's so much money that they never use it. It's not even effective. To launch weapons like that on a battlefield. What, you're releasing an aerosol and fucking an open field? All they got was like, oh, the guys, they would put on a gas mask. That's why in World War II we have pictures of like fucking people wearing gas masks, because that's it. It wasn't enough to neutralize the population, but it was enough to where they might be irritated for a brief amount of time and then it dissipates. So they were like, we need to give this up because it's costing us more money to even go down this rabbit hole, but we'll do it because we care about people. And that's why they banned it. I mean, it's all this stuff is every area that's people would say is controversial. UFOs, JFK, all this. It's controversial because we can't talk about these things. And that's the best tactic. It's why, like Larry Hancock, for instance, how come he is a well-respected researcher who documents stuff on UFOs, reading strictly from the documents, does not speculate at all, and also does documents on JFK? People go, well, he's interested into a lot of conspiracy topics. They're only conspiracy because there's legit actual things you can question. And the best way to get you to not go into a topic is by labeling it conspiracy.
Yeah. I mean, you're right. And Larry Hancock's a good example because he does amazing history work. And then it gets, let me think how to say it. It
I'm
gets a
doing
little
some
bit.
fucking rants this episode, aren't I? Shit.
Well, I don't know. It's a conversation, as you say. Um, yeah, but Larry, his work, it's interesting. Like, because we had that conversation on your show, and that was a really cool opportunity. And
You're
he
welcome, peasant. No, I'm kidding. I'm kidding.
yeah, but well, I mean, I do appreciate the opportunity to talk to somebody high profile like that, like a director of the Scientific Coalition for UAP Studies. I wouldn't have an option otherwise. It was very nice. And but he, in his conversation, like he knows the history, he knows the documents, he can like cite the details. Like he's one of the few people that when I bring up like, oh, the 1952 internal CIA memos after the July Washington events with the UFOs, he's like, he knows what those documents are as well. And that's, in part why people sometimes think that I am like on that side of things because I am aware of the documents. And typically people who are aware of the documents are using them to support a narrative that is typically a conspiratorial narrative. And Larry's very good about that. But then he even in our conversation, he did bring a little bit of bias. And if you remember, at least on two separate occasions, he told me hands down, he says about UFOs, these are not natural phenomena. Like very like that's just like a statement of fact. And like I don't know if they are natural phenomena or not, but in my work, when I look at the internal government documents and the CIA documents and the UK Ministry of Defense documents, are both saying that they think that they're natural phenomena, and then I look in and we haven't touched on it at all, but we have many times previously, like the peer reviewed data or published papers that say like ball lightning is a real thing and it can be many meters wide,
I,
so it
I I
can
came
look like
across a
these
site
things.
that had documented ball lightning deaths, and I think over a total of
Well, that's interesting.
50 years or something like that, there was a number of, I think, 10 deaths that they had recorded. One person had lost their brother or something, was hit by ball lightning. It looked like he was hit by lightning in a sense, but they said it was ball lightning. I mean, there's documentation on it. It's not impossible. I know ball lightning exists. I've seen videos on airplanes of that type of shit as well too. And I know films that have mentioned it a couple of times as well too. But when we get into an area where like me and Larry would probably have a biased, and I'm not going to put words in Larry's mouth here, but I think we probably both have a bias when it comes to government fuckery, only because we've looked at the CIA documents specifically for JFK. I mean, I was coming across documents about a person named Joylon West, who was the same psychiatrist not only for Jack Ruby before he died, but also Charles Manson. And Charles Manson was getting his drugs from a place called Haight Ashbury, which Haight Ashbury was run by the fucking CIA. They were giving him drugs. And there's documents that talk about giving, like Operation Midnight Climax is drugging people. Well, it goes a little bit deeper and darker than that. I mean, there was a death of a 3-year-old girl who was raped and murdered by a guy who didn't remember it. Thing is, that guy gets arrested, taken to the sheriff's office, picked up by the military, then after 2 hours, dropped back off at the sheriff's office and doesn't remember a fucking thing. That was one of Joylon West's patients. That's documented as well too. But what they classify these places like they're basically apartments, and what they would do is they would have someone dress up like a hippie, and the whole apartment would be set up like a hippie commune. It would have like a bunch of hippie shit all over the place. They would lure in people off the street, and what they would do is they would offer them free drugs, and people go, fuck yeah, I want free drugs. And they would take drugs, and these people would just go insane and fucking be out on the streets messing with domestic population. They were testing out their drugs. Now, that's documentation that we do have. But people would call that a conspiracy. And it's like, when you go into something, you don't necessarily, especially if you're looking through old documents, they're very honest about everything that they do. It's just about being interested in trying to find that information. And you're not going to be interested in finding out that information unless you're trying to verify if it's true or not. And we don't have these public discussions about this type of shit. We don't, when I'm talking to someone at my gym at 5 o'clock in the morning about JFK, you know, they're looking at me like, what the fuck are you, like what I just told you? They go, what? And I'm like, oh shit, I forgot. You're not at the speed I'm at right now. Let me get you to my speed and help you get there. And it's very, very difficult for some people, don't want to know about it. And if we don't have these discussions, then we never evolve the conversation to a deeper point. And I think probably if you start looking at, if you just type in UFO on your computer and you see all the perspectives out there, people that think there's, and I've talked to them all, people that have experienced UFOs, people that say that it's a weather phenomenon, people that say it's government tech, people that say it's drugs, people that say it's religious things that we're excreting out of us. If you keep all those perspectives in your head and then you go into the document clean, not having any personal bias of what those things are, you're going to come across information that's going to reveal the answer, depending on the document. Some of the documents may sway one way and another document may sway another. And I think that's the important of when we talk about verification in documents. Whether you want to say the government's lying to you and they're just putting out propaganda, that could be true too. But also, if you can back up the document with the thing that you say and you stick straightly to the evidence, I respect that more than anything, because now you're not speculating. And that's very hard to do in a subject matter that doesn't really have a lot of information behind it.
Absolutely. And the speculation's a really good point about, like, if somebody finds something descriptively, like if you observe something that's unusual and then you just describe it in purely physical terms, that's one thing. But then if you take that description and then you combine it with your interpretation of what you saw, and the interpretation is outside the person you're talking to's like sphere of reference or like accepted categorizations within a reasonable sort of like level of expectation, if you have the hypothesis that is extreme, the person will reject the observations based on you interpreting them in a certain way. And that's a big problem in science. And that's actually an example of from like many rare, previously unknown natural phenomena like meteors, for example. Like, how could somebody convince you that a meteor was, number one, a real thing if you hadn't seen one yourself? Like back in the day, I'm talking about, like, let's say the Middle Ages. How would somebody be able to convince you that they saw a meteor come out of the sky and stuff like that, or that it even happened? And then they're saying, I saw an angel, and they're saying, I saw a luminous being come down from the sky and the light of the Lord shone from it, all this stuff, right? Like you were talking about, like the way that they described it in the old documents, maybe put on their subjective perspective. Like, that's the interesting question. How the heck? And then we take that and we look at the UFO subject. This is something that Dr. Hynek used as an example because it's so effective in relation to the UFO subject. Once somebody's seen something that's outside of the frame of reference, you can't replicate it. Like what do you do with that? And you end up in this circumstance where you're looking at the eyewitness stuff. But like, what would your perspective be like in, let's say, the mid 1700s? Benjamin Franklin figures out how to reliably produce a electric charge from getting a lightning bolt to strike a kite with a metal object on it, and then he tries to convince other people that he's identified that the lightning is a huge version of just like static electricity sparks. Like, why would people believe him? And they wouldn't believe him. And that's the key to modern science, is that he wrote out letters explaining exactly how to do the same thing yourself. But you can't do that with meteors. So like for you, thinking about the Middle Ages and that description, like would you ever accept that vision? And if you accepted that they had seen an object with those characteristics, do you think that you'd necessarily frame it within what they described it as? It's like, I saw a angel. Or would that just be like, okay, whatever?
I don't think you have to even go that far back. You could go back even sooner. The Holocaust. There were people that were screaming about the Holocaust. I actually had a couple of people on my show talk about it. They wore a white flower on their shirt in honor of these people that wore this type of thing. There's a couple girls that were screaming about they were killing Jews long before the government even got involved. But if you look at the history books, we think the Holocaust started at this point. That was America's involvement, and it had been going on a lot longer than that. People were trying to shout from the rooftops about it and were hung. They were trying to alert people about it, but we didn't. America didn't. What we record as the Holocaust. We didn't get involved until we got involved. Like we didn't record it. It doesn't start to us or to start to anybody in our history books until we got involved, and we were forced at that point. We necessarily didn't even really want to get involved. I mean, you look at an aspect of just one country really taking power and doing a lot of work based on how small they are, and that's Germany. That was in fear for a lot of other countries, which they decided then to get involved because they thought it was going to fall on them. It's a domino effect. Same thing with JFK. JFK thought if he lost Vietnam, then all these dominoes would fall, and next thing you know, we would be in a crazy situation. If you look at the agents, Dulles, Helms, that were in charge of the CIA, Hoover, everyone, even Eisenhower, everyone thought the best way, a tactic to win a war was by going over there and showing how much muscle you have to stop them from doing something dangerous. And that wasn't JFK's plan. JFK's plan was to just create peace, have these united fronts of peace. He had a famous speech about peace, but everyone pictures the speech of him talking about shadow societies and shit, which kind of sucks, but he did so much more than that. But off that topic, when it comes to the way that we tend to record things, when you look at documents, when you look at the history books, a lot of that can also be what are earlier accounts of that. And you start landing in areas, for instance, where we talk about why does Russia, when we talk about their history or what they're taught in schools, is a completely different aspect of the war against Germany than ours is. And that's because what they were worried about, like battles to us, for instance, Pearl Harbor, at least in America, Pearl Harbor's one, 9/11's one. They know about it, but that's not what they're focused on. They'll tell you about the Battle of Kitchev, whatever it's called. They'll talk about a bunch of things. I remember I talked to Roddy Rodinger on this show. We talked about memory, and that was the thing when he asked a bunch of people about different aspects of the war. People were taking different things out of the war with Germany. That's because what hurt you the most or what affected your country the most, where you live, where you grow up, that's the history that you're going to learn. So I think when you look at that aspect of things and when you start realizing that there's a lot of other things that probably we could talk about, different depictions or different levels of intellect, maybe not as far back as you go, but as far back as I went with the Holocaust thing, there's just information that more people are focused in on, and it's what's going to end up trickling down the lines. For instance, if me and you were following two different researchers, you studied Massimo, for instance, and I studied Larry's, I'm going to have more of a bias towards government tech. You're going to have more of a bias to light phenomena or something in our subconscious or something like that, because that's what your researcher focuses in on. So when you gather information, you can't just pull it from documents. You got to pull it from individual researchers as well too, but don't just focus on one. I don't know how many times I've heard the account of I followed this researcher specifically. I can tell because I'm finding clones of this person in your shit. It's like comedy. Comedy back in New York, everyone used to have like the Dane Cook comedy routine or the Dave Attell style, like talk like this. Like they all had these mannerisms, like that were famous comedians because that's who they idolized and that's who they eventually followed. You got to be careful that with that of your information as well too. If you strictly stick to debunking things, you're only going to want to label out every claim or try and find a coincidence where there's necessarily a coincidence because there's fuckery afoot. And I think that's very, very important when we talk about gathering perspectives of things. I mean, I'm sure over the past couple of years or so, or I wouldn't say a couple of years, probably 2 years, we've known each other that long. Since you've been on the show your first time, you probably don't think even close to what maybe the same way you thought before when you were first on here explaining not only about me, but just UFOs in general. I mean, you probably think and understand a little bit differently. And that's why you change your site to adapt to a new style of thinking and new information that you have as well, too.
Well, that's yeah, that's a very solid point. And let me think about.
I ranted again. Damn.
Well, not really. I don't know. You were coherent. I took a couple notes because I was following your train of logic.
Are you really
Just
writing
to
stuff
address
down?
just a couple of like individual things because I wanted to remember some. I'm trying that for the first time right now, actually, because I was reading about how to accurately or effectively respond sometimes. So anyway, yeah, with the website and stuff and my perspective evolving over time. I agree in some ways, but not in the way that I maybe would be expected. Okay, so my history is, like academic atheist type stuff. I've never in my life ever had any feeling of there being any kind of like religious thing. I've never had that sense of there being a theistic or deistic entity out there.
Not even
So
when
I
you were
don't.
researching fairies?
No, never.
Okay.
And I only indirectly researched fairies through the UFO anthropological lens. But yeah, exactly. Like I've never had this sense of belief, and I don't know if that's hardwired or what, but that's just the way that my brain works. And you could call that a bias. I am, biased towards naturalistic, mechanistic, physical explanations for things. And it maybe is a bit I would argue about whether that's a bias or not, but I accept people labeling it that way just for simplicity. But if the evidence we have that's available has demonstrated consistently every single time in the past that when we have attributed something to a divine or theistic authority, it later resolves to be a natural phenomenon, then if we've had 2,000 instances of that, if we've had 5,000 instances, then I'll say that it's most likely that the next will also be that. So I don't know if that's a bias or if it's just like pure probability, but I'm fine with saying I'm biased. Now, in terms of like my original website, it was completely different from how it is now. That's not because my perspective has changed. And this is something that I get a lot is people project onto me and they say, you just like ball lightning. You're trying to prove that UFOs are ball lightning. You're trying to get rid of the subject by proving it's ball lightning. And that's something that people have done in the past. I just have no interest in doing that. I don't care if UFOs exist. And if they do exist, I don't care what they are. Like I only started researching this last May because President Obama drew my attention to it. And I was curious why an American president would be encouraging people to consider the UFO subject at all, because it flies in the face of the historic standard. When I got into it, I was looking first from the academic sources. So when you type in UFO on research databases with peer reviewed papers, you know what comes up? Dozens or hundreds of published physics papers by physicists who are talking about ball lightning. And many of those talk directly about how they think that UFOs are some kind of ball lightning, at least, the ones that people report with these features that are consistent of the way that the government has historically described them in their now declassified memos. So, like when I come forward with this information, I'm like, there are dozens of these physics papers that have been published in peer-reviewed physics journals that's with biophysicists who are saying that they think that these observations are of ball lightning. People are like, you're saying it's ball lightning, you're trying to prove it's ball lightning. And it's like, I don't give a shit if it's ball lightning or not. I have never had any interest in ball lightning. Zero. I have zero interest in ball lightning. Yet people tell me regularly that I'm obsessed with ball lightning and I'm trying to prove that UFOs are ball lightning. And, it's exactly what you're talking about. How if you are purely describing information and pointing at, well, these dozens of physicists are saying this. And then when you look at the historic declassified memos, like the CIA and UK Ministry of Defense decades ago were saying that they think that UFOs are ball lightning. That's not me saying it. That's me pointing out to y'all that these prominent agencies that have secretly studied it for years and modern public figures in the physics community are saying the same things. So that it's worth taking a look at that and considering it seriously. So it's very important to separate sort of the researcher from the actual information. But when you do start speculating in the way that you're describing, that's when inject a personality, and then people will discount the actual information based on their dislike of the personality's subjective interpretation of it. So when I first made my website, I wrote it entirely from the perspective of trying to, in a kind and understanding way, show UFO community members that this data exists to essentially validate their historic experiences. Because if people have been seeing ball lightning, then it has the features of classical UFO reports. And then these people have been told their whole lives that they're crazy for seeing something and it didn't exist. And then there are these peer reviewed papers and government documents that are like, objects with these features do exist. That makes me sad that they've lived their whole lives being discredited and called insane and being ostracized and stuff like that. And now I completely changed my website in January of this year because it wasn't having a meaningful effect, because people in the believer and experiencer community have so deeply tied their identity to the idea of UFOs being this transformational, revolutionary phenomenon that might change the world because it's like a non-human intelligence that's coming to save us. They didn't care about the information that even would validate the raw physical nature of their experience. They were focused more on the interpretation of what it is. So I changed my website completely in January of this year to be focused instead on scientifically minded people and skeptics and stuff like that, because I saw value in educating the skeptic community, who has historically typically an open mind to new information, and they'll process it according to the scientific method. They'll sincerely consider peer reviewed papers and stuff like that. And I've seen a lot of relative success in a relatively very short period of time compared to my attempts to actually assist directly the UFO experiencer and believer communities. My focus is still on ultimately helping the UFO believer and experiencer communities, but my methodology has changed from direct appeal to indirect attempts to influence the skeptic community to accept that there may actually be a physical reality occurring based purely on the science papers and the declassified documents. Yeah, what do you think of that? I've changed from sort of direct to indirect because of a desire to actually produce a greater effect. What does that sound like to you? I'm just curious.
I would say lose the part where you said you're trying to prove something, even if it's validating people who have a historical experience of something. I would just say like when you come in trying like with a message like proving something or doing something like that, it's going to be taken either which way. What I noticed is like people that like even when you're if I was going to create a site specifically about documents about like government mind control stuff, I would be picking out documents, but I would be cherry picking the ones that I liked. You know what I mean? And unconsciously doing so. And I think, especially like we talk about, like just coming across various vast sources of information, I think a site, especially one like yours, should just be more directed to just documenting information that you find interesting instead of trying to show things. Like that's what I don't like about like anytime someone says I'm going to show you something, like it could be like a friendly thing. First of all, I got to avoid being a hypocrite here. I like speculation. I really do. It's great for conversation, but it's not good if you're trying to enter a debate with somebody and you start speculating. That's where I draw the line of speculation. Like you never see me enter debates on anything. I don't debate people because I don't want to sit there and be like, well, I saw this document. I 100% like when someone says, I saw this that shows this. I would say, where's your proof? And I've done this on forums. I'll post a JFK episode or something, and someone will comment, well, we have this and we know this is why this isn't that. And I'm like, where's your proof? Where's your evidence? And they send a message back like, what do you mean? Where's my evidence? So like, you're telling me I'm incorrect. Show me why I'm incorrect. And then they don't post anything else after that. I don't like that type of stuff. I think if you're going to engage someone and saying that they're wrong, then you have to have the information to back up your source claims. But when we talk about speculation, if someone tells me that they saw this thing that showed that this was this, awesome. I believe you 100%. But if you're going to enter a debate, you got to make sure you can show that shit. So it's great for conversation. That's why when we have these, like even Twitter spaces, I think when we talk about the social media aspect of it in the beginning, all of it's like fighting in the UFO community, unless they're talking about a bunch of people that are grouped into the same subject, like experiencer stories. It's going to be a bunch of people that experience stuff. You're not going to have a debunker jump in there and try and debunk them. You know, it's
No, you do sometimes, but yeah, no, I get your sense.
but it's that invasion type thing where we need to start looking more at an example of, I think speculation is good. I think having documentation is good, but there's no way to show documentation to something that isn't just going to piss one person off. I mean, I've talked to plenty of filmmakers. I'm making one of my own. You get criticism. I get criticism over my shows. Someone doesn't like a guest, they'll dislike it. Not you, they didn't even listen to the conversation. They'll just dislike it because they don't like that person I had on, or they don't like me. I don't know. But you get into this aspect, you're going to upset somebody and you're going to have a bunch of people that like you. The best way you can do it is the way that you feel comfortable in, which is trying to piss off as less people as possible. And that's just by having an unbiased site. If that's, I have a couple sites I have listed and bookmarked on my thing that are researchers that are no longer here with us, but they paid for their site 10 years after their death. So that site will be up for another 5 years or 4 years or 3 years, which I think is valuable for people that can screenshot and grab as much of that information and transcribe it onto whatever site they want to use it as, with giving that person credit because they're no longer with us. I think that shit's important. And I think when we talk about setting the historical record straight, I value that over everything. If you tell me aliens are real and it changes the historical record, let's set it straight for the good. But we're not going to get there by getting into arguments with each other. If you want to talk about, let's stick to straightly the documents. I think the way you have to do it with your site, and even on your site, I think I've mentioned, you said a couple of times, like, I'm not trying to say it's weather phenomena. And I'm like, you're, no offense, your site does come off as like it's trying to expose that it's weather phenomena. I'm not saying it's your fault, but I think it's also like the mindset of going in there trying to show documentation to either back up a claim, but you also set later down the line. But you got to think when someone clicks on your site, the first thing that they see is like that information that shows weather phenomena and talks about that, even though there's a section that could list at the bottom religious or beliefs or mythological things. Nobody's going to scroll there if they already see that at the top that doesn't fit their narrative. So I think the best way to do that is put like a disclaimer at the top of it. Like, this isn't showing this or showing this. All I'm doing is representing documentation that's been documented to at least make you think a little bit. And if anything, it sparks up. I think there needs to be enough conversations or educational value taught in just sparking up interest in something. Like, I don't see a lot of that. Like whenever I like come across like a film or something, it's always directed with us. Like you cover the JFK topic, they're going to focus on his JFK specifically, Oswald, or they're going to focus on Ruby. What about just highlighting every single aspect of it? Like all the shit that was going on. It's a lot, but you can condense enough of it so much so that every person gets 5 minutes of every single flag you want to raise. If nobody's questioning afterwards, then you failed your part. So I think it's the same thing with the UFO topic. Instead of focusing on weather or focusing on government, highlight everything. give every single aspect a thorough look through, especially if you make a film about it, just so you show everybody like, hey, it's all in here. If you at the end don't know what the hell's going on, welcome to the same boat I'm in. And at the same time, you should be questioning what the hell is going on. And it sparks up more curiosity. We don't have that in our education systems. In our historical record or historical value of things, you can't really speculate a lot. A lot of it's trying to figure out and write down historical record for time period reasons, and also educational value. But what happens if the historical record isn't correct? You're telling me someone gets taught something for 50 years, and then next thing you know, you teach their grandkid that actually we found out now that that was wrong and this is right. Now you have two separate generations that are now not able to agree on the same narrative based on one person that learned the wrong history and one person that's now learning the new history. So you start seeing these notes of things everywhere where you start going, why is that like that? And you realize it's the best division strategy possible. I mean, I know so many young kids my age that don't want to hang out with their grandparents because they don't agree, whether they're too woke or whatever you want to say. It's just generations. It's that gap period. And that gap period might actually not just be real, but it's also might be manifested through a lot of our implementation when it comes to education. I have a huge issue with the education system, but I know it's made a lot of improvements. But my issue with it is the factor of it's not set up in a sense of trying to be open to all perspectives. You know what I mean? Like when we talk about teaching the war of Vietnam, if you're in the education system down here, you're learning the war about Vietnam. But what about the war or the Vietnam account from another perspective from someone that wasn't on the winning side? So, you know, you get into an area like I know people that talk about the Vietnam War was a horrible thing. And it was just a crazy, it wasn't just because of Agent Orange, but it was because of what we did to the Vietnamese. And we go, wait a minute, what? We were the bad guys? And you're like, yeah. And you're like, holy shit. But then I hear that and I go, fuck, is this a fucking Democrat that's so revved up to the point where, like, and that's what you see a lot on the Democrat side. And that's okay. I'm not a Republican or Democrat. I hate them both. But you got to understand, like, there's perspectives of shit that whether you agree or you disagree, maybe the whole factor is that it's set up to make sure that you do agree or disagree. You pick a side. And I think that's very, very important. And I noticed that through a lot of things that necessarily wouldn't even be arguments or big controversial issues, but we make them so.
Yeah, well, that's a big
I'm
it's a
really
big topic.
pissed about the world. I'm sorry.
No, it's good. Now, okay, so I agree with a lot of what you said. For my website, and maybe I'll tie in the education stuff you were just talking about. But I agree entirely that the outcome, the product of my site is looks like this is some kind of ball lightning weather phenomenon. Now, this is what I was sort of getting at earlier. I didn't go into it. I had zero interest or awareness. I didn't know about ball lightning at all until I started looking at UFO stuff, because when you type UAP into research databases, dozens of physicists' papers that have been peer reviewed and published in prominent physics journals come up where they're talking about it. So they don't talk about other stuff. They aren't talking about, oh, it's aliens. They're saying the objects with these features, as a physicist, this looks like ball lightning. And then I went into the archives of the government archives, and the government archives of the UK and the United States, these intelligence agencies, the Ministry of Defense, Defense Intelligence Section 55, and CIA, internally, they're saying, we think this is a weather phenomenon. And so the outcome of the site, by describing those documents, produces the effect that I'm trying to push a specific narrative that I want people to think that it's weather phenomena. Like, and this is what I was getting at before. I literally do not give a shit about ball lightning. I don't give a fuck.
I can tell
This is the crazy part.
you've been getting criticism for it, have you?
Well, I mean, people do think that a lot, and what makes me sad about
That
it is,
Campbell Moreira is a CIA agent. He's a plant. He's that dude. All right, so
I get that 100%. There's a guy, Vincent Bugliosi, who happens to be one of the people that have written books that the government, or that it was Lee Harvey Oswald that killed JFK. But he wrote a book on Charles Manson that talks about all the drugging and the government was supplying him with his things. That's the same thing I told you about Gerald Posner writing a book about the Vatican and the pharmaceutical industry, and then writing a book saying it was Lee Harvey Oswald. I start going, did you cut a fucking deal? Did you make a deal with the government to say that I will promote this narrative if you give me information on that subject, or just doing them a favor and them giving you classified documents later down the road. That is not, and that's what they figured out with Vince Bugliosi, Tom O'Neill, the guy I want to have on my show, but he's charging $5,000. I gotta save up. Yeah. But he did an interview with Vince, and Vince ended up suing him, and then the lawsuit ended up being over after he died. Like, I think it was like 2 years later. He died in like 2015. The lawsuit ended in 2017. But he said something that was supposed to be off the record, but the recording was still going. And he actually just wrote it as like a first person thought, I guess. And he mentioned that, like, yeah, I went this way with this because I was given information on this. So you realize he did a deal somewhere in the mix. And is this the same thing from this aspect going on to other aspects of things? But I don't know. I didn't mean to hijack that.
Well, no, yeah, that's something that's once again historically demonstrated to have occurred in the UFO community as well. There was a researcher named Bill Moore, I believe his name was, in the, I want to say 80s, maybe early 90s, that he kept coming out with these remarkable new documents that he was getting leaked to him from an inside source. And then years later, he came out and he, like, at a UFO conference, he gave a speech where he said, I was knowingly spreading fake documents from a US Air Force intel agent into the community because I was trying to build a relationship with him in order to get real insider information. But these documents I've been spreading were from, a disinformation agent, and people obviously got very upset about that. So, they're in that. Well, and you know what? That it's a historical fact that he said that, and it's a historical fact that the person, Richard Doty, that he was interacting with was a U.S. Air Force intel agent. It's not proven that Doty was acting on orders from U.S. Air Force intel. So I just want to make that very clear. But there are examples of things like that that seem to have occurred historically. So there's merit in considering it as a possibility. Now, just to get into like describing.
Wait, real quick before you go into that, can I ask, is that a real plant?
Oh, yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, it's a money tree.
Oh, yeah, that's right. You told me that before.
yeah, having the fake plant, that would be funny. No, I've been caring for that thing for like 5 years now.
All right, next question. What's the next one you had?
What was I saying? Oh, yeah, okay. So, like,
writing it all down like a fucking guy investigating me for sins against humanity.
Yeah, and instead I'm just trying to
this is a form of brainwashing.
Points.
I'm brainwashing people right now.
Oh, yeah, you're influencing public personality identities.
Can you do a little research for me and figure out why the fuck John Lennon is connected to all this shit? Like, people like John Lennon's death. John Lennon apparently saw a UFO. Remember David Halpern told me that. But then I look into Manson. Manson was saying that he was getting messages from the Beatles' White Album.
Oh, yeah, you're right. Yeah,
so it's like,
think that.
What the fuck? Is John Lennon an alien?
Oh, that's funny. I mean, unlikely, but maybe.
That's my conspiracy shit. I have these moments where I say like really prophetic shit, and then I ruin it by saying something like that.
Yeah. Well, the Manson stuff's really interesting because of all those connections, right? Like, he was living in the Beach Boys mansion with his, right? So very strange.
I can probably talk about this, since I'm probably not going to end up having somebody on my fucking podcast about it, because I reached out to the people of Jonestown. They keep a site going up there that says that a lot of people don't, you know what Jonestown was, right?
Oh, yeah. Jim Jones. But I thought they all are there any left?
There's a lot left.
Really?
People that lost family members that were involved in it, people that got out of it early. And they have a whole site that shows the information of it. I don't think it's going to happen, because every email I sent to someone, they kept bouncing me back from person to person to person. And I get it, because of the way that is historically remembered, is that they got to verify before they just come on a show and make sure you're not just going to make fun of them or set them up for something. But one thing that I started reading from a lot of this, like, they were very, like, I got 6 emails in a row over like a week time period where I just stopped responding because it was pissing me off so much. mostly because they just kept bouncing me around. I fucking hate that. Tell me to talk to this person. I message that person. Tell me to talk to this person. Message that person. Tell me to talk to this person. Why do you want to talk to us? What I found in the FBI archives, they have over 200 parts on Jonestown, and each part is about 700 pages of documentation. Um, where I think the FBI not only helped incentivize, or they did, there's accounts of them breaking into Jonestown. But some of the documents that I looked through, they got with media outlets to distort the public and say that Jonestown was this horrible cult. Now, in a sense, people did die. That is real. But if you look into a lot of the people that experience this type of stuff, they have a different experience of what we remember it as, where you start realizing maybe the media reported on it, but a one-side narrative, much like CNN will give you one-sided news and FBI will give, or Fox News will give you another side. They might necessarily be reporting on the same thing. So our historical record might not match what the actual scenario happened based on the people's experiences who live there. And you might look at that, and one of the fucking people involved in fucking Jonestown was Joyon West, who in his Wikipedia description is described as working with cult activities. He would break into cults. They had FBI agents that would break into Jonestown. They had all this type of manipulation and shit that was going on in Jonestown to help distort or pull information from what these people are doing. Also brainwashing the public into thinking that these types of cults are horrible cults. And it's why I said history's sided on one thing. So when you think you know something about a subject, I really advise anybody to go research more into that subject and try and understand from the people that experienced it. And that's why I'm trying to get the JFK thing so figured out, because I'm looking at history and documents, but I want to speak to the people that were there as well too, but there's not really a whole lot of people around, and you don't want that to be with anything. If you can't talk to the people that were involved in the UFO topic in the beginning, my issue starts to be, is it because you're keeping those names confidential? What happens if they release those names? And then people who might have experienced something yesterday could experience the story from someone who experienced something from 60 years ago. Try and find. That's why they have groups that talk about like alcohol issues and shit. You got to find commonalities amongst this type of stuff to help decipher information further.
Yeah, well, and that's a good point. Like the way that the government approaches these things, it's typically really consistent because there's a lot of good science-backed evidence about how to influence various communities. And this reminds me of the UFO thing. And I just want to point out, maybe Jonestown isn't a good example, or maybe it's not of the best example because they all did end up committing suicide based on the leader's direction to
I'm
do
not
so.
rationalizing them. I'm just
No.
saying
And a lot of
there's like 200 something people that are still alive, and their biggest I would say issue is that they talk about how people label them as idiots because they followed this type of thing, when their description of it is nothing like that. They like the community aspect that was
yes, and
involved in it.
that's a really good point too, that a lot of the time things that evolve into cults originate from a social community that usually starts out being not at all well, in some instances anyway, not at all radical. It's just a social group based around typically a influential personality who ends up over time becoming increasingly radicalized. And often it's a feedback loop where when a community starts to be investigated, they then become more insular. Like Jim Jones moved those people down to South America because of the pressure that was being put on him by the government, which was merited. Obviously, in retrospect, we can see that, but it's an unfortunate feedback loop where the increased pressure on him because he was starting to do increasingly shady things led him to displace everyone to Latin America, and that produced an effect where he had exclusive, complete control. Which and that's an interesting question about harm reduction. To what extent do you allow cults to operate domestically? To the point where if you start investigating them, then they radicalize. I mean, you can't allow things to happen just because of the consequences of the person who's doing something bad. But it raises a serious question, and in context of the UFO subject, people are always like, the government is hiding aliens, they're hiding infinite, whatever, 0 point energy. They're hiding this, they're hiding that. And it's presented in like kind of like an evil way. And like, obviously that's a possibility, but I would argue that the government is comprised of individuals who are individually operating in a way where they think in their own hearts, typically, that they are doing what's best for the national security of the country. And so when you look at the declassified documents on this exact subject, like the UK report I described, UAP and the UK ADR, they're talking about exactly what their rationale is. They're saying, we're worried that the Russians might be ahead of us on this subject of the technology derived from studying ball lightning, and that we need to get on top of this for national security reasons. And it's like, you read that and it's like, well, that makes sense. And it's like, there are all these people out there who are experiencers, where and the UK report says this, like, UFOs, in quotes, like these ball lightning phenomena, sometimes may approach people in a similar way to being struck by lightning, right? And that's part of why people attributed intelligence to lightning historically, because if you're walking alongside somebody on a dirt path and then suddenly out of the blue, a lightning strike out of a blue sky can happen. And it hits the person right next to you, like, you'd have to assume that that was some kind of divine intervention. There would be no other explanation available. And so the UK Ministry of Defense report says, like, ball lightning sometimes do strike people, similar to what you were talking about, that website that documents injuries from it. And the UK report says sometimes when the ball lightning approaches someone, it's emitting a lot of radiation and it electromagnetically couples to you and starts basically channeling energy through your body, like how a lightning strike channels through your body. And that intense radiation can produce hallucinations, or at least vivid recollections of a hallucinatory experience later. And so you have a circumstance where this UK report is saying, like, we recognize that UFOs are these like ball lightning objects coming and attack, like in quotes, like, attacking people, coming at them like lightning and injuring them, sometimes killing them and stuff. And we know that that's happening, but in the greater interests of national security, we're going to keep all that secret because it's very rare. This isn't happening super often. So like, I understand both sides. Like, it could be seen as being evil that they're kind of like sacrificing these individuals in their attempts to gain a greater understanding of this phenomenon before their adversaries do. Or you could say, like, oh, by protecting it and trying to develop it internally, they're like serving a greater cause and actually producing a net good over time. And so it creates like this moral controversy, right, where there is no clear answer. But it does make sense to me that some people lean into one side or the other of that.
Also, I would take an examination of the time period as well too. I mean, if you look at Independence Day, when that movie was released, how many people started seeing UFOs after Independence Day was released? Also, if you look at District 9 was released around the same time people started to storm Area 51, with Bob Lazar's documentary being right on top of that as well too. I mean, if you look at for instance, it's just understanding the value of the time period. Like a lot of like old school, like during the 60s and during the 70s, a lot of fear was put into communists, fear with Russia. So many of these types of things where you start understanding is like, that's a really big fear back then, was going to war with Russia and Cuba and all these other aspects that were going on. So think about maybe people thinking this is a way to stop us from going to war. This is how I'm going to write down this. I mean, there's a lot of witness testimony when it comes to like JFK. People that just felt like they were like, oh my God, if I give like maybe a real answer or something like that, and this is what you can say could be conspiracy, but people that just agreed with the official statement from the Warren Commission, just because of an aspect, they thought they were going to go to war, they were going to go to jail, or they were going to do something. I mean, Dallas politics at the time, most of the members on the force, I think, were openly KKK members. Like, there's just a lot of weird shit, like crooked stuff going on with gangs and all these types of things. People that said that they saw a couple gang members do these types of things, but then they were in fear that they were going to be killed by gangs. I mean, you have to look at the influence of opinion based on the time period or whatever that was back then. You can't really insert the perspective we have now with the perspective they had back then. I mean, people can say that this person's at this or this person's this. I'm like, Alan Dulles was one of the CIA agents but he was like apparently a bad guy from a lot of researchers I've talked to. But if you looked at how he was observing things, how he was writing documents down, he was seeing it as like, I have to do this, or we're going to end up going to war, we're going to end up this, or we're going to do this, and we're not ready. And it's just like had this whole different scenario built up into his head. And that's very, very difficult when you're in a position of power, because then you can morph things to start going that way as well too. So I think if you look at like back to UFO subject, if you look at things of like, we look at, I know there's a funny weather phenomena experience. A person was hit with ball lightning, and they talked about how their vision had been skewed to looking through like binoculars. It felt like they can only see through like little binocular, like basically small little circles in front of them. They couldn't see any of their peripheral was gone, everything was gone, but they could play piano fantastically. So it was like they never had that skill before, but they could learn fucking piano. That's weird to me. But look at the time period of when people are experiencing the peaks of it, and then when people stop seeing it, and then find those outliers and realize maybe this is something that could be going on for a very long time, which we have recorded documents on, or maybe a bunch of people that are just influenced by something that they saw during the time period that they saw it. I mean, the reason why we even have documents in the first place about unidentified flying objects is because of the war with Russia, of the fear of communism, of these types of things. And so a lot of the documents do talk about that before they even go into speculation about what that thing is. It needs to be verified in the beginning, which is what everyone was worried about at the time about communism. Was this a Russian UFO? The documents all state in the very first paragraph, at this time, we cannot concur that it is Russia or any type of enemy equipment that we have come across. It's usually something like, then they start going into speculation about maybe it's this or maybe it's that, something was recovered. And then, only get from, that's why historians are important too, but make sure you got to choose the right ones. And when I say choose the right ones, make sure someone's not writing a fucking book that they're trying to promote. Like, you got to make sure you pick a historian that doesn't necessarily have a bias. They just kind of looking at the documents and just willing to speak about the topic because they genuinely care about the topic.
Well, and that's a really it's a good point about framing things within the historic and cultural context, and also the external factors. I don't know if you've heard this. Tell me if you have. In World War One, originally in the British Army, their hats, their military equipment, the hats were fabric, and there were a lot of head injuries. And so they brought in metal helmets to better protect the heads. And when they brought in the metal helmets, head injuries went up dramatically. Now, how does that make any sense, right? What you would think is like, oh, the helmets are producing more head injuries. It's the exact opposite. Fewer people were dying from head injuries, but being injured. So the helmets were doing what they should be by saving people, but they produced a higher number of actual head injuries on paper. So, it's like with the UFOs, things can trigger waves through the cultural prompts.
Well, that's like the statistics for knife wounds in UK. The statistics of knife injuries went down, and people go, oh, we must have lesser knife crime. No, it's because hospitals have gotten better at treating knife wounds. So you get into this area of like, no, there's still the same or relatively close to the same number of knife wounds that are still occurring, or knife attacks that are happening, but hospitals are better at saving people's lives. Paramedics are faster. New technology has gotten equipped to that. So statistics are a fucking weird thing, man. I know they say numbers don't lie, but people hijack those numbers. I think I got introduced to this with climate models. Like when they do a projection in a climate model, if you think that the world is ending tomorrow because of climate change, they will project it to make it show that. You know what I mean? Like it's based on what they think it is. And then if you say someone that the earth isn't warming, then they'll show you a projection of how they, obviously it's not. Well, you both have a bias. So now the projection is going to be biased to whatever you're biased in. So, I mean, for me, it's just a bigger push. If you want the real information, you got to kind of have people that don't have necessarily bias, but you can manipulate data and whatever you want to show. And then people, if they don't like it or agree with it, they won't want to go with it. So I'm definitely pro organizations that I think you should be researching something you necessarily couldn't give a fuck about. Mostly, I would like you to do good research. I know you need people to be passionate about something to research something, but also I don't want your fucking biased in there. Like I know plenty of historians that have different accounts of the Bay of Pigs or all these other types of situations where I'm like, Jesus, just trying to understand it more. And I can't, because everyone's got a different perspective of who was right and who was wrong.
Yeah, well, and I'd love to hear your perspective for me, because hearing that and hearing what you were saying before about my website, I'm not sure what the solution would be, because when, like, if I looked inside the peer-reviewed physics journals and there were physics papers saying like, oh well, this seems to be a non-human intelligence, like that's what the website would be about. If the declassified internal government documents were saying like, we think that these are extraterrestrials, that's what the website would be about. But because all of these sources are unified independently in saying, we think these are ball lightning, we think these are ball lightning, that's what the website ends up being about, because it's the descriptions of the content that I found when researching UFOs out of a curiosity of like, what's going on with this subject. So like, based on what you're saying, where you're saying like you don't want to see bias, and I agree with that, but then you also have to have a passion for research to produce the outcome. Like my passion in quotes was like, why is Obama trying to like get people to think about UFOs? I'm passionate about understanding the American government's intent with that, and the outcome was, you know, this all this crap about ball lightning, something I had never thought twice about ever in my entire life, and still don't care about, independent of this research. So like hearing that, like, and you're correct that the outcome of the website is like, it's like, it seems like this guy's like arguing that this is ball lightning. And in my own internal mind, psychologically, it's like, I'm not making an argument that this is ball lightning. I'm presenting the conclusions of the, you know, all of the available high credibility evidence. Like, to say anything else, I would have to be diving into kind of subjective interpretations and stuff, which I don't really have a lot of interest in. So, like, knowing that, um, let me think. Okay, so a good
Well,
example, like
let's say
maybe,
you
yeah,
need to put a banner on your site before you even scroll down to the information, a banner on the site that says, this site is only to document what has been recorded by other agencies of the government about unidentified aerial phenomena and their conclusion of it. And then put a period and then just say the biased at this time, and then bring up the perspective of what the government would be looking for first of their checklist, or what they would assume it to be, and why it's recorded that way. Then make sure you try and phrase it in a way where it makes sure it's not inserting your viewpoint, just strictly what the documentation and how the government is viewing these things when they're documenting it. And then scroll down to what you have document wise, so people don't, so people read it, they go, okay, at least he's putting like a thing where they understand you're not the one, you're just showing them what you found. It's not necessarily trying to
right.
prove a point.
Okay, being more explicit. That's a good point, and I'll aim to do that. That's a good piece of advice. Just to emphasize this briefly, because I think it's so important what you raised about the perceptions of the people seeing the same information producing a different effect. Can I ask you subjectively, like, what's your opinion of the founding fathers of the United States? If you were asked by like a foreigner who had no awareness of them, just like, or like, who were the founding fathers? Like, what was their sort of like deal? What were they up to? What would you say?
I would say the same thing of why I find interesting aspect. Like when I say MLK smoked cigarettes, people say don't slander his character. I go, I think it makes him more human. When I say JFK was a hound dog, or he had extramarital affairs, which was known, I don't say it to slander his character, but I think it makes them more human. I think we in society have built a life of wanting our superheroes to be nothing but superheroes with no flaws. But superheroes have or Superman had kryptonite. When someone asked me about what I think about the founding fathers, I said the founding fathers were advanced thinkers for the time period that they were in. But a lot of things don't age well, and a lot of things don't get recorded because it doesn't sound right. I know books that I've read that slander Abraham Lincoln, but I know books, and my perspective of Abraham Lincoln was he was a very revolutionary guy. I mean, I brought up an aspect of Abraham Lincoln didn't want to free the slaves. He wanted to free the slaves that weren't ones that he owned or people in his union owned. So you get into this aspect of like, that's document proof of that. We have documentation saying he didn't want to free every slave. He didn't want no slaves. He just wanted specifically certain other slaves to be free. You know, he didn't want a whole, like every single citizen owning them, but he didn't mind having some of his own. And you get into this aspect of like, when you find out the real history is not supposed to scare you. But when it's so far from the real history, the one that you are being told, it's going to shock the shit out of you. And when someone asks me, a foreigner, about the founding fathers, I would say they were revolutionary thinkers for the time period that they were in. I mean, they accounted for government corruptibility. That's why they listed 2 terms. But at the same time, they had their flaws. George Washington's teeth weren't made of cherry wood, they were made of slave teeth. I said, with every blemish, and I think this is where we can probably agree on the CIA, for instance, if they just told you the honest shit of what they had and what they did instead of trying to cover up so much, people would accept it. But they dig themselves in a deeper hole. And that's what we've done with history by hiding these blemishes and making people turn out to be these perfectly molded figures throughout society. It's good for a history book if you're trying to build a fucking comic character, but give it the real information so people can have a better grasp of where they live and what times they're in. I think that's important. I think the founding fathers were important. I think they did a lot of great things. I think government's needed. I think secrecy is needed. But what they deem secret, I fucking question. What they deem private or confidential and the actions that they say are justified, which in my opinion, some are not justified, are questionable. And I think you should respect the people as much as you're trying to say that you're protecting them, and the same aspect of giving them the information if they're willing to accept the cost of knowing that information.
Yeah, well, and Gerald K. Hines, the chief CIA historian in the 90s, said exactly what you're pointing out. In the instances where the CIA historically tried to cover things up, those cover-ups were far more significant and harmful to the CIA's reputation ultimately than the actual things that they were trying to cover up. So the cover-up was worse than the thing they were trying to cover up. And that's something you see often in a lot of different aspects. And like when it comes to the founders, like exactly what you're saying, like there is such a mixed bag there. And you know, you can both recognize that Benjamin Franklin was one of the geniuses of history.
He had bodies in his fucking basement.
Yes, yes.
I'm so fascinated with that small aspect of his life where I'm like, why? I don't find that scary. I just find that fascinating as hell. People do weird shit, and I like the weird shit. I want to know that George Washington took his socks off before he got down to business with his wife. I want to know all that shit.
Yeah, those are the personalization details, and they can go positive or negative. And that's an issue though, like with history. A lot of people, as I'm sure you well know, react extremely negatively to bringing up the negative aspects of the founding fathers' lives. And they'll typically say that, you know, it's like the radical left or whatever is trying to destroy America by discrediting the founders so that people no longer listen to them. But once again, there's this nuance, right? Where somebody can be a murdering slaver and they can also produce scientific revolutionary discoveries that are unprecedented in history, as in the case of Benjamin Franklin's work with electricity and figuring out how charge works and stuff like that. So it's a mixed bag, but like the tendency in people is to say that by bringing in information that is true but they don't like, that you have a bias, you're trying to influence their opinion and stuff like that. And maybe that's true, but it's incorrect to then say therefore what you're saying in total is not worth anything. Like with Thomas Jefferson, like the man was incredibly intelligent. He wrote very eloquently and had some very revolutionary views on the philosophy of freedom and liberty. But then he was one of the richest men in the New World and the extremely prolific slaver, and in his personal life did horrible things to his slaves, using the children of his domestic slaves as tools in order to manipulate the slaves into continuing relationships with him. That's historically documented. He brought his his slave with him to France, where slavery is illegal, and she could have walked away from him legally, but he coerced her to return to America because he kept her children at his ranch, and like he was said he would not free them unless she returned with him to the slavery. So that's a monster. Like, there's no question he was a monster. But to say that, if I was to try to talk to somebody about it, they'd say that I was not worth listening to because of that being like, so many people's minds, it's like a monster should not be listened to on any subject in any way. So it forces people to ignore the bad parts if their brain is producing that effect, right? So it's like, what do you do with that? And I think you've brought up some really good points to me that I'm going to consider very seriously about the website, how it should be presented and stuff, because everything you're talking about I agree with completely. And the question then is like, how would you convince somebody both that Thomas Jefferson by modern standards was literally more monstrous than anybody I have ever met or can really imagine in person, and yet he produced this philosophy of freedom and liberty that sticks with us to this day as an idealized standard that people, new countries still use as the basis of their constitutions, even though Jefferson himself felt, as the American Supreme Court ruled in 1855, that no Black person, free or enslaved, is intended to be seen as a person under the constitutional law. So with Jefferson, like, so it's like he wrote this beautiful document about freedom and humans and personhood, but then the intention that he in his own mind had was no Black person should be considered a person legally.
He
Like,
was
how?
fucking he was like this. He was
Well, and he had
begging.
his own children that were exactly
It's the
fun
same
as
thing as that
slaves.
representative that fought against the gay marriage bill for gays not to be married. And then he goes to his son's gay wedding. Like, it's just, they're fucking hypocrites. It's mostly when someone says like they're trying to reject, gay people having rights and stuff, and you find out that person's gay I mean, it makes sense. I mean, apparently J. Edgar Hoover was gay. I don't know. There's some of the people on the trial that were investigating Garrison. I don't know if it was Garrison, it might have been Shaw. He was gay. I mean, they were murdered, and people would say that it was a right-wing act against gay people. I have no fucking clue. But the idea that you can have one thing and then also have the complete polar opposite. I mean, I fucking spend so much time researching and fucking having serious conversations, but then I like to joke around and kid. People, he's got a sense of humor. But then if I do nothing but comedy conversations and try and do a serious topic, nobody fucking listens because they don't take you seriously from all the you can't have one without the other. God damn it. It's so fucking stupid. The way that people's minds work when it comes to this is this and this is that, and there's none of this. Oh my God. And then like they're blown back by this. I'm like, of course, always expect something like that. Usually one person's saying one thing and then behind the scenes, they're doing something else. Always expect that shit. It's very hard to find authenticity. I like to think that over the 1,000, I've stayed relatively consistently the same. And it's documented as that. I literally people could say this is like a on-air personality. It's not. I get too much shit from people in my real life going, God damn it. Like, it's, like I'm talking to them like how I'm doing with you on this show. It's great for a show, but it's terrible in real life. You get fucking annoyed quickly. And it's just like, no, it's just like, you gotta understand, like, the only person who really cares is yourself, because you care about what other people think. So when you talk about an idea of what you support or what you can't, you got to look at when someone does something great in history, are you going to hold them by the asterisks you put by their name? Babe Ruth, what was his, Barry Bonds? What, he took fucking steroids? The fucking sport is to be the best specific specimen you can possibly be. Now, natural, sure, but he enhanced himself with fucking steroids. So you put an asterisk by his name in the historical record, and you put him on a different list based to natural and unnatural, like bodybuilders do. We criticize, steroids have taken a major turn in this society. But there's natural competitions with bodybuilders and there's unnatural competitions. Jack them up with steroids and join the unnatural competitions and see how good you can get your fucking body to look. I mean, we don't yell at them for doing that because they're admitting to it. I mean, there's now if they like Liver King was a person that was exposed as taking massive amounts of steroids, but he would just lie to people and say he ate liver. But fucking Adkins is a good example too. Adkins had a diet trend and then fucking falls and cracks his head open on ice. Like you just like, is he off balance because he lost so much weight? I mean, he had ties to the sugar industry. He had ties to all this shit. You just realize, like, whenever someone says they're doing something, I mean, we've gotten to this. It's not their fault. It's our fault as a society. We've gotten into a point where we want to hide our blemishes and we don't expect people to have them. But I know for a fact, every single person listening to this fucking masturbates. So don't fucking tell me we can't talk about porn or sexual things because it's deemed wrong in society when every single fucking person does it. It's nuts. It's a hypocritical thing we do as a society, and it's fucked up.
Now that started to sound a little bit like a rant. Not that I disapprove.
It's true though. We all demonize sex in these horrible ways, and religion and political stuff, even though we all like fucking talking about it, or we all do it at some point. We're all interested in politics. We're all interested in sexual shit. We're all interested in all this. Don't act like it doesn't fucking exist. You're not a kid anymore. Santa Claus isn't fucking real. Grow up and move out into the fucking world and understand there's going to be shit you don't like in this world and you just block it out. That's it. You don't have to acknowledge it. You don't even have to hate on it. Just fucking walk away. It's someone else's reality that they're living in. Now, it becomes a bigger issue when we talk about things that are systematically changing and oppressing society. But if you think you have any power to do anything about it, you're fucking wrong. It's all the political elites. Blame it on them.
Well, if I don't fully believe that last piece, I think that individuals working together have produced amazing change over time historically. And so I do see hope there. But I also agree with you that the historical precedent has also been a very effective response from the institutions of power, often suppressing those social movements. So
I always go dark. I always go dark. Everything.
Well, and I appreciate the dark side as well. That's probably why I'm badly affecting my public reputation by using my real name in the context of studying UFOs type stuff, and people seeing like, oh, he's looking at UFO stuff. Oh, Campbell Moreira. Oh, UAP study. Oh, he thinks that they're aliens, right? Like I'm potentially trashing my reputation by having my real name associated with it, but it's because I have a genuine interest in it and I'm working publicly and it's a tiny individual effect, but I'm doing what I can as an individual to try to enact change on that, because what I've found in the documents suggests that this is something that's going to evolve into an actual quite interesting field of study moving forward, primarily, I think, from an anthropological lens, which I believe that you can appreciate. It's because it ends up being about the perception. And that's how anthropology studies the UFO subject and studies a lot of these kind of conspiracy related subjects. It's like, why is the individual processing this information in that way? And I appreciate the way this conversation's gone, because I think that that's been sort of the underlying theme throughout, is the influence or the impact that the individual brings to raw data, and the implications that can have in terms of presenting that information to others. So just for my own purposes, I've really appreciated the direction that this has gone, and I'm gonna take a look at my site and honestly apply some of the things we've discussed here.
It's a good site. I've promoted it multiple times, but one more time off the top of your head, please let people know where they can find your links.
Yes, uapstudy.com is the website, and then my Twitter is UAP Study, so it's pretty consistent.
Make sure I link it all in the description. And thanks for listening to this episode of Out of the Blank. Stay tuned for next episode.